wait a couple more minutes, but let's get started and just say, I'm Rodney Sadler. I am the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, and I'm pleased to be here with you all this evening as we partner with Roberta Wall for this incredible conversation tonight. We are thrilled to death to hear from Sarah, and we are excited about not just the topic, but sort of what this means. And as we begin to think about this topic, I've been constantly thinking about how does this work? How does the way that our brain work shape not just the way that we deal with issues of race, racial disparity, racial difference, but how does it shape the way that we deal with ideological difference and things like that? So I'm eager to hear as much as we can. Let me turn it over to Roberta just to say, not just greetings, but to give us a notion of how we're going to handle the conversation that goes on after the talk tonight.
Thanks, Rodney. Thanks, everyone. I'm used to Rodney saying a few more words at the beginning. You not in the mood?
No, I could say a whole lot more. But I wanted to turn it over to you before I talk a whole lot more.
Oh, all right. Because you were going to share what you shared the other evening in a call. Okay.
I'll start off with this then.
Okay.
Right now, as an African-American male, I am incredibly in an incredibly difficult place right now. I'll just say that. This election in the last few days has been very difficult for me, not because of the issues of who won or who did not win. I'm pleased with the outcome, as many people on the phone are, with who won the overall presidential election. But I think the greater concern for me has been that as many people voted for Trump as did, and not because he's a different political party or different political ideology, but because he represented a legitimate threat to my ability to survive as a Black person in this country. Much of what he said was not just insulting to Black and brown people, but represented an existential threat to our very existence. As we continue to wrestle with issues of race and racial disparity in America, we in Charlotte have been working on something called RAP Track, which is the Reimagine America Project, Truth, Reconciliation, Atonement Commission for Charlotte. And what this is an opportunity to begin to look at the way that the concept of race continues to promote inequality for us. How thinking that race is a legitimate ideology allows us to legitimate notions of Blacks living in the ghetto. It's okay for people to be underserved. It doesn't disturb us when we see suffering in Black and brown skin. We've got to find a way to move beyond that. We've got to find a way to open up new doors and think beyond it. I often use this as my metaphor when I talk about issues of race, the larger concept of the rose bush. A few years ago, I planted a rose bush outside my house next to my mailbox. And the rose bush was supposed to be a big, pretty rose bush with pink flowers that I thought the neighborhood would love. And as it grew and grew around the mailbox, it got to be rather large and pretty, had great pink flowers on it. But the mail carriers would come through and they would stick the mail in the box and prick themselves on it. And the kids would ride their bikes around the cul-de-sac and they'd run into the bush. And so eventually my neighbors and the mail carriers asked me, Mr. Sadler, will you please get rid of this rose bush? So I realized that it had become a nuisance in the neighborhood. And I said, okay, fine, I'll get rid of the rose bush. And I cut it down. But in about 3 weeks, it had grown back. And then, so I cut it down again at the end of the season. But by the middle of the next year, the next summer, it had grown back again, cut it down, grown back. And what eventually became apparent to me is that it didn't matter how many times I cut the rose bush down, because the root was so strong, no matter what happened, it would keep coming back. And then I realized that, in essence, this is what we do in America with issues of race. We see an instance where an African-American gets shot by a police officer. An African-American gets killed by an officer with a knee on his neck. And we say, oh, we're going to fix this as an issue. We're concerned about it, and we're going to address this as an issue. And what do? We put cameras on police officers. What do? We change the policies for intervention. We give people an opportunity. We say that we're going to do something to shift the dialogue in the moment so that procedures will be different. And what ends up happening? Well, the exact same thing happens over and over again. In essence, what we continue to do is we continue to attack the presenting issue, the rose bush that's there. But what we never do is we never deal with the root. And so I think it's time for we as Americans to begin to address the root of the issue. It's time for us to begin to dig down deep and begin to explore what is it that gives life to the racism that we see expressed. And this is the notion that we are somehow or another fundamentally ontologically different. So I think it's time that we begin to address the larger issues, the root of the issues, and begin to address the concept of race. So as we have this conversation tonight, one of the things that I'm excited about more than anything is this will help us, this might be a conversation that helps us to recontextualize the way that we think about race and racial change. Are there neuroscientific factors that we have to begin to deal with? Is it more than just changing the way that people think in their hearts and minds? Is there something else going on that we have to attend to as we start thinking about how to begin to make not only individual shift, but unless we can begin to make individual shift, the larger society shift as well. So I'm excited that we have this as a potential for discussion tonight. These have been rich conversations that we've been engaging in since, when did we start this conversation? It was sometime before the election started, so it must have been April or May of last year that we started these conversations. And these have been rich conversations. We started off with a discussion about the difference between Biden supporters and Bernie supporters, and whether or not we can begin to have conversations that might help us to think differently, to hear in a different way, and to stop always trying to present our ideas, our issues, but actually to hear and engage what others were saying. And Roberta really did a fabulous job of leading us through, giving us different principles that we could try out over the various weeks to help us to truly engage in listening to those who are different in a way that is nonviolent, in a way that is engaging, in a way that expresses a greater sense of love. As these conversations have continued to unfold, we've begun to dig deep on issues of ideological difference and even racial differences and racial disparities. So as we begin to think about what also might be beyond this or beneath these kinds of differences, I'm even more excited. So I will turn it over to Roberta, and let's get Sarah started so that we can begin to engage in this conversation. I'm sure at some point in time in this conversation, though, we're going to break down into small groups, and I don't know how we're going to do that. Let's see. I'd like to break down into small groups. I have to figure out if I'm able to do it. I think I don't have control of that anymore. I'll have to ask Sarah to give me the power back again,
yes,
so that we can break into small groups and have some discussions a little bit later on. But right now, let me turn it over to Roberta.
Thank you, Rodney, and welcome everyone. Catherine, hi. So as Rodney just mentioned, we kind of frame each of these conversations in an experiment with a different principle of nonviolent communication. And because the theme tonight is white fragility, I thought, well, let's frame the conversation in self-acceptance. So when I, as a white-bodied person, really commit to an endeavor to understand where I'm showing up, I'm avoiding what's uncomfortable or in a way that is really contributing to the oppression of people of color, that's a problem. However, I want to also know how to nourish and sustain myself so I can stay active and involved and enjoy life. And so I'm thinking of the saying by the great poet Audre Lorde, and I'm going to paraphrase. She says that self-care is an act of resistance. Self-care is an act of resistance. So as we plunge deeply into looking at white fragility and how it's contributing to the oppression and exploitation of people of color, it doesn't mean that we're saying white lives don't matter, right? It doesn't mean that we're saying, you know, we don't care about the health and well-being of white people. We're saying just the opposite. We're saying that all of us together need to learn how to take care of ourselves so that we can resist the domination systems. That's how I see it. And the big example I had this week is that I was in a conversation with a white male outspoken Trump supporter. This was our third conversation. He really wants to have these conversations. So part of me is very grateful for the opportunity to get in there. And at a certain point, I realized my body was just like, I can't do this right now. I cannot be in conversation with this guy. And I turned my back. And my old habit before I learned nonviolent communication would be to really get down on myself. Like, Roberta, come on, you know, you want to be not just an ally, you want to like be in there, you know, and look what you did. And that would have been, you know, the way I would have talked to myself before I learned nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication taught me to say, wow, this is really hard. You know, if I really want to learn how to engage with people who support Trump, I need to sustain myself. I need to reach out to my allies, to my community. I need to fortify myself. And that's okay. It's okay for me to take care of myself right now. So as we go through this conversation tonight, I really want to encourage us to go to the edges, go to the places that are really hard. You know, whether you're a white-bodied person on this call or a black-bodied person, it's like, if we're not disturbed by what we hear and challenged, you know, we're probably not going as far as we can. And at the same time, it's not a should, it's not a duty, it's not an obligation. It's, wow, there's something important here for me. That's why I'm doing this. So that's kind of how we try and hold, part of how we hold self-care in nonviolent communication, like preserving our capacity, building up our capacity so we can go to the uncomfortable places, you know, not to beat ourselves up about it. So that's all I was going to say tonight. And I would love to just go right to Sarah. Does anyone have any questions or anything before I introduce Sarah Peyton? Okay, so Sarah Peyton is a nonviolent communication trainer. There's about 5 of us on this call. Hi, everyone. And Sarah has really been, I would say, educating her community in neuroscience, like what's going on in the brain. So I'm just gonna turn it over to you, and if there's anything else you want known or said. Oh, she has a book that I have right here, Your Resonant Self. We could post a link to that at some point. There it is, Nancy's got it. So thank you so much, Sarah. And
thank you, Roberta. It's such a pleasure to be here with you folks who are working on this issue. The first thing I'd like to know from you, Rodney, is what time would you like to be able to put people into the small groups? That'll help me kind of measure what I'm doing.
So we usually go for an hour and a half to 2 hours. So why don't we do this? Please feel free to speak as long as you'd like. I think you've got a very complex topic. But if you can give us, let's say, if we can go until, let's say, 8, a little bit after 8, and then if we can have the rest of the time between
yes,
8 and 9, I guess we can break into small group conversations.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that would work.
Okay, well, the first thing I'd like to say is that my whole world is about the convergence of an understanding of what brains do and how language changes brains. I'm very, very interested in this. So I'm very interested in what is going on with white fragility and why, what is it about human brains that takes people into an experience of white fragility? That was the question that I started with in looking at this. So the place that I started was with the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and took her some of what she has written about white fragility as a starting point. I have a sense that it's beginning to open out even beyond what she's thinking of as I deepen into my understanding. But I'm in the beginning stages of really starting to unpack this. I myself had an experience this summer of being told that I was tone policing. And I was like, what is tone policing? I did not even know what tone policing was. And what I had done is I had said that I didn't like the use of the word Karen to as a blanket word to cover all sort of difficult white women who are calling them managers and the police on people. I had a worry that it was taking away their humanity. But the person that had used the word Karen was a person of color. And my community was in an uproar because they wanted me to understand that we need to begin to really listen to each other and to be able to support a deepening understanding. And so I thought, okay, here I am. I'm doing this thing. This is part of white fragility. Now, what can I learn about it so that I can figure out how the heck to find my feet here? Because one of the reasons that I became a nonviolent communication trainer was to be able to be in the world and do less harm. And so things like learning about microaggressions, learning that microaggressions actually impact people's health and immune systems, that the more microaggressions, there's a particular study, there are many studies, but there's one in particular, Asian American women, the more times that they're told, oh, you speak English very well, the more times that they're told you must be good at math, things that you would think of as fairly innocuous if you were not beginning to understand the harm that we do to each other with language. We see these women having heart disease, the more microaggressions they receive, more illnesses, more difficulty recovering from illness, more chronic illness. We cannot live in the world in ignorance and do no harm. So that is sort of where I come from in my standpoint. Bringing this to you, bringing this material into the world, it's an ongoing discovery, an ongoing exploration. How can we learn about our human brains and invite them into a deeper and deeper humility so that we live in the world and we really do no harm, or do as little harm as possible, for goodness sake. So I'll just pause there and see if there's anything that needs to be cleaned up or caught before I go on. Okay. So
is that
here,
inviting questions? Is that what you mean by that?
And I'm always inviting questions. Roberta said that she would keep an eye on the chat for me because I can't both read the chat and focus on the slides. So if questions pop up, you're welcome to either just unmute and ask them or put them in the chat, and Roberta will interrupt me. She will feel very comfortable doing that. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can have her help. Yeah. Okay. So now I just grabbed an echo. I'll mute you, Roberta, and see if that helps. Yeah, that helps. Okay, so you'll just, can you unmute yourself, Roberta, to come on? Okay. All right, so now we'll begin. We're calling our presentation this evening the relational neuroscience of white fragility. And relational neuroscience is a phrase that I love. It's for a part of science, of neuroscience, that's actually looking at how are our brains changed by relationship. And what we find at root is that our brains are only changed by relationship. That is the only way that we change, is through the experience of actually understanding our impact. That's what changes us more than anything else. So let's start by talking about domination systems, in particular, white supremacy. Domination systems infiltrate every element of people's lives in order to perpetuate themselves. And we'll take white supremacy as an example. And here's a fairly long definition of white supremacy, which you're going to be very familiar with, but I'm going to read through it just because it's a foundational starting point for getting this understanding of white fragility and how pervasive it is. White supremacy, the conscious and unconscious, systemic and personal prioritizing, and the expectation and pressure to maintain that prioritizing on people who are perceived as white in the distribution of all resources and in the immunity from even knowing that the systemic prioritization exists or that it is doing harm. Resources include, but are not limited to, these are the resources that go to the people who are perceived as white. They include, but are not limited to, health, life expectancy, autonomy, more immunity from police violence and incarceration, more immunity and protection from social and environmental trauma, like racial injustice, immunity from having to explain the system to their children, including how it will impact the children personally, immunity from the fear parents have for their children being targeted and harmed simply for the color of their skin. Legal prioritization, time, attention, finances, including wealth, investment, salary levels, loans, purchase and transmission of property, education, sovereignty of bodies, suffrage, reproductive rights, determination of and power over others' lives, including marriage, civil protection, non-consensual access to bodies with less power, including sexual, physical, emotional, and medical harm, access to God, administration, social power and address, license to remain unconscious of impact, hierarchical positioning, including mentoring and promotion, decision-making power, determination of emotionally allowable expression, and prioritization of needs. It is a juggernaut of immunity and privilege and resource that folks with white bodies step into without even knowing that they're stepping into it.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Can you go back and explain, can you go back on to the last
Totally.
slide?
Yeah, totally.
Can you explain more about determination of emotionally allowable expression?
Sure. So I'll take like an average home. This is also tone policing, but so we got an average home where we've got hierarchical power, and the person who has the most hierarchical power in your average two-parent home is often the father. Not always, sometimes it's the mother. Whoever's got the most power determines what emotion is allowable. So is it okay for me to cry? In my family of origin, no, not okay for me to cry. It would have been too upsetting for my father. Was it okay for me to be angry in my family of origin? No, it would have been too upsetting for my father. Is it okay for a black-bodied person to express anger in a white supremacy culture? No, not okay. Is it okay to even express grief? No, not okay. There's almost zero allowable emotional expression for black-bodied people in white supremacy culture to be able to express what's actually happening for them. It's dangerous. There's attacks. People are killed. It's it's a very intense and repressive way that the domination system works. Is that helpful at all?
It is, and I would also like to point out that there's also from that framework that you're describing, there's also a lot of abusive behavior that is allowable. Not only is the free expression of emotion by others not allowable,
Right.
there's also this license often given to the person that holds the power to be abusive, be aggressive. You know, they sort of
Absolutely.
have permission to let it all fly, but no one
Yep.
else has that same
Yep.
freedom.
100%. So true. And that's here in this non-consensual access to bodies with less power, including sexual, physical, emotional, and medical harm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I agree completely. Yeah. Anybody else just needing to say, oh my fucking Lord? Yeah.
The one that stood out for me was access to God. That one was
Yeah.
like, ding, what is that? Like, intrigued me.
Yeah, yeah. So who gets in the church institutions that have a lot of power and money, who gets to be there? Who gets to be who gets to hold the power? We see this a lot. This is even more apparent when we're thinking about patriarchy, but it also happens with whiteness.
Never thought of it. Thank you.
Yeah. So now, thank you for responding to that. It gives me a sense of accompaniment at looking at something really big and really hard, and something I don't want to be true, but that certainly is true. So white fragility now, a definition for you, and we may expand this. This is a new definition that I created especially for the group that I was working with, that Roberta first saw this presentation with. The tendency among members of the dominant white cultural group to display discomfort and have a defensive, wounded, angry, corrective, or dismissive response to information and feedback about racial equality, inequality, and injustice, especially, but not only, when they have personally enacted patterns of white supremacy. So we've got white fragility patterns that are sort of the initial white fragility things that folks do in white supremacy without even knowing it often. And then we've got this secondary response. Now, what's so interesting about white fragility is that I noticed the author of the book, White Supremacy and Me, is a person of color. And this person of color author used the phrase white fragility about herself. She said, this is an example of my white fragility. And I thought, oh my goodness, here we're beginning to touch that the fragility is a tendency that any group that has power has. So wherever we are in intersectionality, wherever we have more power than someone else, we as humans with our human brains will have a fragile response to being told that we have personally enacted patterns of injustice and domination. So we may notice it if we're not a white-bodied person. We'll notice it a heck of a lot if we're a white-bodied person. But if we're not a white-bodied person, but we're a person of color, and someone who is in a wheelchair begins to talk to us about something that we may have done, then there will still be fragility patterns. If a child calls an adult on misuse of power, it's a very rare adult that can step into saying, dang, you're right, I did that. Instead, we see discomfort, we see defensiveness, we see dismissiveness, we see corrective responses. Don't say it that way, don't do that. And so we can use these words white fragility, we can use these words white fragility to take full responsibility, both collectively and personally, for issues that are at hand. And we can also look at fragility in all the places where we have more power than someone else, not just in our whiteness. So Victor Lewis is a speaker, is an African-American speaker whose work I appreciate very much. And he says, being white never means never having to acknowledge that whiteness means something. And then that was a chart that just shows all different kinds of intersectionality and where privilege shows up. So one of the things that I mentioned here in the white fragility response is the tone policing, is the corrective response to information and feedback about racial inequality and injustice. And because tone policing was such a learning for me, I did want to spend just a moment just giving you a sense of what it was in case anybody else is out there in the world doing these kinds of things, which I wish I wouldn't do. I wish you would say that in a nicer way. I refuse to talk to you until you change your tone. And then some other examples are, I can't take in what you're telling me because you sound too angry. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Your tone is too aggressive. Your language is hateful or divisive. You should be more civil if you don't want to alienate your allies. The way you're talking about this is not productive. If you would calm down, then maybe I would want to listen to you. You're bringing too much negativity into this space and you should focus on the positive. One that I have experienced when I begin to speak about this is this comment, your language is hateful or divisive. Sarah, you're being divisive when you talk about even we're talking about white fragility. So just allow yourself to notice if any of these things are comments that you have received, in which case they have a health impact on you. And let's just acknowledge that and be with that with self-compassion, self-acceptance, and with a capacity to be able to say, of course, these have an impact on me. Or if we know we've said these things, then again, coming back to what Roberta invited us to in the very beginning, the more we step into self-acceptance and humility about human patterns of power and privilege, the more that we can allow ourselves to move out of these destructive, harmful, health-impacting, violent ways of speaking. Now, I wanted to mention this in particular because there is so much of an influence from nonviolent communication. And in nonviolent communication, we're so often teaching people to say things in a different way so that they're easier to hear. And we even have in our nonviolent communication teaching, many teachers have a hard to hear messages exercise where they compare what it's like to speak without nonviolent communication and with nonviolent communication. So I just wanted to bring this out even more explicitly in terms of tone policing. So it's something that we have in mind and hold as we go through our lives.
Sarah,
This is a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate you bringing these out, this tone policing. I don't know how many times I've done conversations on race and heard those exact same statements come up at different points in time.
Yeah.
And it's nice to know that, you know, it's not just me hearing this, but that this is part of a larger phenomenon that we should attend to. So thank you for pointing that out. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you, Rodney.
So sometime, I don't know if we'll have time tonight, but it sounds like practicing what would be a way of bringing yourself into connection with someone that isn't tongue policing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be sweet if we all had the capacity when somebody is starting to express the harm that's been done by white supremacy, if we were able to say, damn right, instead of saying, can you rephrase that in feelings and needs? So an invitation to all of us to begin to step into something slightly different than what we may have done in the past. Did you just speak, Roberta?
Yeah, we lost the the slides?
Yes, I was just coming.
Oh,
to
great. Well, it's
Yeah.
wonderful to see everyone. If everyone wants to take just a moment to turn on your gallery view, you can just see
Yeah. Take a look at our folks.
we're here.
Yeah, here we are.
Thanks, Sarah.
Oh yeah, a pleasure. Okay, we'll go back into the slides for a bit, and whenever you want to speak, please speak or write it in the chat. And I love the conversation. It makes it much more meaningful. So another quote that I love from Victor Lewis: being white means never having to say you're sorry. Here are the white fragility patterns that I harvested from Robin DiAngelo's book, and I put them into 5 main kind of categories, and they could be rearranged, and I may end up rearranging them the next time I do this. But at this point, here are the 5 groups. One is lack of understanding about what racism is, dismissing what we don't understand, a lack of racial humility, an unwillingness to listen, assuming everyone is having or can have our experience if we are speaking as white people, a lack of authentic interest in the perspectives of people of color. For white people, the number 2 group, seeing ourselves as individuals who are exempt from the forces of racial socialization, a failure to understand that we bring our group's history with us and that history matters, speaking as white people there. Claiming exemption from the forces of racism as an ally. I added that one. I think she may have it later in the book, but I've gotten through about 2/3 of the book. Wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions. Guilt that paralyzes, and third group, guilt that paralyzes or allows inaction. A defensiveness about any suggestion that we're connected to racism. A focus on intentions over impact. Dissolving with grief and or shame when faced with the knowledge, but taking no action. 4th group, needing to maintain white solidarity to save face, to look good. And 5th group, preference for racial segregation and a lack of a sense of loss about segregation. So just holding those patterns that lead to oblivion, that lead to harm, that lead to a violence that harms folks of color. And I love that the number 2, under the lack of understanding about what racism is, names humility. Because in all of our work, where we're looking at how the human body and the human brain assume power, the only real remedy is humility. There's a remedy of having close personal connections across differences that allows us to be connected with one another, and that changes us deeply. But in terms of the unconscious pattern of the human brain that we all step into, because we all have human brains, the more power we have, and as we saw in the white supremacy definition, the power that goes to white-bodied people is enormous. So the more power we have, the more we need to walk with humility. And the more we walk with humility, the less we are subject to the vagaries of simply being a human brain with power. So first we'll look at this first group, and we'll look at what I know about the neuroscience that can lead to this way of being with our brains. A lack of understanding about what racism is, dismissing what we don't understand, the lack of racial humility, the unwillingness to listen, that assumption that everyone is having or can have the white experience, a lack of authentic interest in the perspectives of people of color. Let's talk about power and privilege in groups so that we can understand a bit more about the human body and the human brain and what it does with power. If we don't have to think about it, it's a privilege. A huge piece of the definition of privilege for me is this word humility. I've got the wrong word. I've got a I'm supposed to be muting people. If you're unmuted, please mute, because there's sound in the background and I can't see you to mute you. I'll say this again. So if we don't have to think about it, it's a privilege. A huge factor in privilege is immunity. It's like, what do we get a free pass on? The more free passes we get, the more privilege we have. The less we understand about what other people have to deal with, and the less that we can even allow ourselves to see and understand what's happening with others. Beauty, wealth, physical strength, sexuality, influence, anything that captures or directs attention within human groups has power. So the more power someone has, the more privilege they accrue, consciously or unconsciously. So a privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted to or available only to a particular person or a group of people. And an example of conscious privilege, conscious use of privilege, is redlining, making laws to keep people of color from buying property in certain neighborhoods, banks making regulations and rules about where they're loaning money and who they're loaning money to buy property where. This is all conscious use of privilege. The whole Jim Crow laws and racial segregation laws in across the United States and in the South, making laws to keep people of color out of public places, to keep people of color out of swimming pools. Those are conscious decisions that people are making to reinforce unconscious privilege. Unconscious privilege, an example is not realizing the ease that comes from never having to think about skin color, not realizing the ease that comes from never having to think about whether there's enough money to buy gas, not realizing the ease that comes from not having to think about whether or not we can get upstairs, or any of another million ways in which life is easy or not easy, depending on what groups we belong to. And then the next thing that we do, we have this tendency to do as humans, and the only remedy is relationship and humility. Our brains can reward us for the gifts of our birth by making us believe we received these gifts of our birth because we deserved them. That's what human brains tend to do. It's unfortunate, and we need to be in a humble relationship with our own capacity for harm and our own capacity to believe these things about ourselves. And here's a picture of the Kennedy boys. Privilege. It's amazing how many people in this world are born at third base and think that they've hit a triple. Paul Piff is an amazing socioeconomic researcher, and he's been looking at our natural tendency to take others into account, and he's been looking at the ways in which advantage makes us less likely to consider others. He discovered that even temporary advantage changes us. If I'm playing Monopoly and I'm given more money to start the Monopoly game and more money every time I pass go, I will start to act like I'm winning because I deserve it. And he did this by doing video of Monopoly players, college students who were Monopoly players, and giving some of them advantage and some of them taking the advantage away from them. How did the winners behave? The winners tended to believe that they had won through their own innate skill and character qualities. They take up more space physically and act with more conviction and confidence. So here's the rich player who's been given lots of advantages saying to the poor player, "You're going to lose all your money soon." This is important, not just for us knowing that we will tend to think we deserve things that we've been given, by virtue of our birth, but we also need to understand this because of patterns of incarceration, and because it helps us understand the tendency toward punitive responses among people who are conservative. People who believe that they have earned their high status, believe, this is kind of horrifying, but these are our human brains, we believe that others have earned their low status. So if we think, I've gotten here to where I am, I've pulled myself up by my bootstraps, I've done this through my own hard work and concentration, then these people believe that the folks who have low status have earned that low status, and then we can also believe that the others deserve punitive judgment. If we're very clear that where we are is by a stroke of luck, that we're white-bodied, that we're wealthy, that we're well-educated, if we believe that this has happened because we've earned it, we're much more likely to believe that others have earned their low status and deserve punitive judgment. And the more power we have, the more inspiring we find ourselves. And we get brain rewards for being self-focused. So here we have generations of white folks being the gatekeepers of publishing, of museum money going to artists, and throughout all of the arts, the more inspiring, the more power we have, the more inspiring we find ourselves. And then there's a dopamine flush, a flow of addictive, lovely, pleasurable brain chemicals that happens when we're self-focused.
I have a question about that.
Yes, please, yes.
Can you go back to the last slide?
Sure. This one or the one before?
Yeah, no, this one. So
okay.
I'm just confused, but the phrase, the more inspiring we find ourselves. So are you saying that people perceive themselves as being inspiring to others, or they're getting their talent, or that the more power somebody has, the more often it is that other people are inspired by them?
And yes.
Okay.
Because when we have more privilege and power, our bodies expand to take up space and we act with confidence. Sort of a horrific cycle of, harm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Isn't it good to have brain rewards?
Well, it depends on whether or not you're using your brain rewards for good.
Okay.
I counted. I haven't done a presentation about this with slides yet, but the brain has implicit biases. All brains have tendencies to be blind to different things and to not want to change their minds. So I counted 51 different implicit biases that lead to racism, that lead to the patterns of domination systems, and part of what happens for brains, and we'll look at this in the slides, so you'll hear it again, you'll hear it twice. But one of the things that happens with brains is that they love in-groups, and in the more out-groups they can create, the happier they are with their in-group, the more oxytocin there is. So if Trump is creating, as he does so often, his most common facial expression is disgust, and that disgust is aimed at whatever outgroup it is that he's targeting in that moment. Every time that his followers join with him to have disgust for the outgroups that he's naming, the more rewards of oxytocin and the hormones of belonging, which feel really good, flow in his followers' brains. So really, humility is a beautiful antidote for brain chemicals that feel good and that take us into destructive patterns.
So this is Rodney bouncing again.
Yes,
I want to
please.
follow up with this. How can we begin to shift? I mean, you mentioned the notion of humility.
Yes.
But if humility is something that seems to have to come from within, how do we begin externally to shift that brain chemistry, i.e., to shift what gives reward or a sense of punitive feeling? I don't want it to necessarily force guilt on anyone, but how do we begin to shift the brain chemistry so you don't feel rewarded by perpetuating these implicit biases?
Yes. The only thing that I've really found and I haven't really found great research about this yet. I don't know what her name is, and my brain has just failed me right now. But what I want to say is relationship is the only thing that changes people. It's the only thing that changes Trump supporters are those moments when we get to say to someone who is holding a harmful view, do you realize that the harmful view that you are holding impacts me? Do you realize that the harmful view that you are holding scares children? It's like bringing home impact on a person-to-person level is the thing that I have seen that actually creates foundational deep change. Which means for those of us who are dedicated to empathy conversations across differences, we want to be sure not to let go of expression. We want to be sure not to just stay in empathy, but to actually say, hey, here I am, I'm a real person, and what you're doing harms me. And this is a part, I believe, of what happens with the education. For example, the education about microaggressions. For people to actually hear that when they say to a person of color, gosh, your English is really good. They think they're saying something nice, but to actually get the education that lets it sink home that this impacts people's health and well-being and stops them from having full access to their immune system, it can be a wake-up call. So, Rodney, how am I doing here with clarity? I'm not sure I'm as clear as I'd like to be. Okay, very good.
Can I just have to ask the question?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out how to phrase this, okay?
Sure.
I'm wondering how people who have privilege, who grew up in an environment around people who look like them and have what they have. I know that the media, the representations of minorities are largely negative, and that somehow I'm thinking that in their brain, they associate minorities as not being as valuable, intelligent, smart. And I'm thinking that this possibly also contributes to white supremacy.
It does. And the Harvard implicit bias test is an amazing tool that allows us to, you can Google Harvard implicit bias test and they put up different tests every month, I think, that let you take a look at the different implicit biases that your brain carries. And in the very beginning, they were doing a lot about race. They've diversified out into many other subjects since the beginning of their work. But in the very beginning, they were looking at the implicit bias brought by the media against people of color. And they discovered that not only did white-bodied people have an implicit bias against people of color, in particular African Americans, but 30% of African Americans were affected by these negative media portrayals and had an implicit bias against themselves. I mean, it just, you know, what makes me want to weep about I mean, I do have to spend, you know, hours every week as I learn about the human brain, mourning its incapacities. You know, there's we are changed by our love. We're changed by our love. We're changed by our desire to live in the world and do no harm, and we have to learn how to do that. We don't come out innocent and perfect. We come out with a huge tendency to use our brains for not good things. And this is part of the reason teachers are so important, Deborah, because they can give their kids a taste of something better. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a comment in the chat.
Yeah.
Rob, do you want to say what you wrote in the chat? I'm the chat monitor. Hi, Rob. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. You know, I'm told that I'm articulate or very articulate all the time. And, you know, my immediate response is to let people understand how that can be perceived is that, you know, I'm from the hood. You know, I'm from where you would think that this is impossible. And a lot of other individuals that come from these environments and currently reside in these environments have the same capacity that I do. They just did not receive or were blocked from opportunities that I have been able to access. Like you said, there's a certain amount of privilege, and I am aware of the privilege that I myself have been afforded, simply because of where I used to be and what I experienced throughout my life. But yeah, so microaggressions come in all forms and fashions, and that's all.
Yeah. And do you need any acknowledgement, Rob, of the sorrow or the grief and the anger that might come when you hear people say, "Oh, you're so articulate," that that there's an implicit racism embedded in it, that you don't want to be there? Is there something like that?
Yeah, I would definitely say that is the case. Simply because that means that you're basically implying like you wouldn't expect me to be able to speak in the form and fashion that I have the ability to. And at the same time, I speak abundance, just as many of other people from my background.
Yeah.
So, you know, I always make that clear distinction between the cultural differences and what's perceived as intelligent actually coincides with conformity to society in a lot of different cases. And just because someone doesn't fit your cultural background does not mean that they do not possess intelligence. And that is how that is perceived to me whenever I hear this statement. So it's like, oh, because of the way my hair looks, because of the color of my skin, and because you may know a little bit about my background, it surprises you that I can speak 4-syllable words and have an extensive vocabulary. Why is that so? Because I know plenty of people just like me. They have the same ability.
Yeah. Oh. Thank you very much for speaking about it.
I wanted to kind of touch on what Deborah said about representation. So my daughter is special needs and disabled, and she's ended up not needing a wheelchair or adaptive equipment that's visible from the outside. But the first couple of years of her life, we weren't sure, you know, would she ever be able to walk? Would she, you know, we just weren't sure. It was just, you just have to wait and see, you know, what the outcome is. And she was behind on all of her milestones. And that was the first time that I really understood representation. And, you know, Deborah, as a cis white woman, I had not had that experience before of, you know, being able to recognize what it means to see people, you know, in your situation. And I just remember I can't overstate the impact of how difficult it was for me as a mom, thinking that my daughter might be in a wheelchair or might have other visible disabilities, to look at the world and the culture around me and realize the utter lack of representation of that. And the fact that I did not see any people, you know, I mean, since she's been born, she's 8 now, and there's actually been a huge amount of progress that I can see. You know, like I notice when I go into Target and the advertisement has a girl in a wheelchair, and there's Barbies with prosthetics now. And, you know, there's been a ton of progress, which is fantastic. But like I said, I get chills actually just describing it, because that was the first time I really understood how much representation matters and how just utterly excluded I felt in those early years when it wasn't there at all. And my fears for her and her future, you know, of what she might experience as she grew up.
Sarah, you're muted.
These things that you all are sharing really bring the material to life. Yeah. So thank you, Rob, and thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Deborah.
And I'll just say, if you want to use the reaction to raise your hand, I'll track that also.
Yeah. I'm noticing what time it is. And this is the time I'm supposed to be ending. Am I tracking time correctly? Because I'm on the West Coast.
Yeah, I think you can keep going for a while.
Okay. Yeah. It's so intense and so important. And okay. Well, I'll just do what I can here, and then just I'll go for another 10 minutes. Oops. And then we'll kind of take a look. How we're doing. Okay. So the more privilege, the more advantages a person has, the more time they look at themselves in the mirror. And privilege can make a person more likely to take candy from a bowl of sweets designated for children. So the more privilege we have, the more we think, oh, it doesn't matter. The rules don't apply to us. The more money we have, the higher in status we are, the less threatening the world is to us. Piff, this is from Piff. You can pay rent or own a home. You can be late to work without losing your month's income. Your neighborhood is safer. And here we see a graph that shows the haves and the have-nots in the US population. Socioeconomic immunity, which comes, as we saw, from white supremacy, can make us less ethical, more selfish, more insular, and less compassionate toward other people. The more power we have, the more our brains tend to be unconsciously biased and dismissive of non-power groups. This is very intense. The greater our sense of belonging, the less accurately we tend to decode emotions and expressions from the outgroup. So every time the Trump followers experience that rush of oxytocin, it doesn't just give them a sense of belonging, it also means that they are less able to decode emotions and expressions. And for us, conversely, if we're engaged in connections across differences, if we feel very strongly connected to our progressive groups, and with a great sense of belonging, the less accurately we will be able to decode the emotions and expressions of Trump supporters. It's just the way our brains work. We tend to not even realize that people of other races are feeling pain. But the more contact we have with people of other races, the more our brain automatically includes them as part of our world, and the more that our brain can see and acknowledge their pain. Relationship changes us. An ongoing remedy for this particular group of white fragility patterns is allowing ourselves to perceive and understand impact.
So one question for you again.
Yeah.
I love this notion of the more relationship we have, the more likely we are to understand it. But what do we say about people who live, let's say, for example, in the American South, whites that have constant communion with Black and brown folk, work with them or some other thing, but have no empathy towards their experience. And I think that this is a prolific experience here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How do we, what do we say about that lack of ability to develop empathy? Is there something else that's at work?
Well, what we're looking at there is the amount of belonging that has been created by white supremacy culture, by racism of all kinds. The more belonging the white people feel to their white group, the less they can even perceive the existence of people outside of their group. And disgust is a contagious emotion. And so we see this so intensely with Trump, with Fox News, the degree to which they leverage the emotion of disgust and make it contagious. It is the degree of their success. So a part of what's happening in the American South is there's a long history of embodied disgust against people of other races, typified by this whole swimming pool thing. I've been reading Isabel Wilkerson on caste, and she's talking about the importance of disgust to maintain caste systems, and the way in which, until very recently, across the country, not just in the South, there would not be Black people would not be permitted to swim in the swimming pool, and they would drain the swimming pool and put new water in if a Black person was in the swimming pool. This is embodied disgust. This is so powerful and so insidiously evil, and is a part of, what I battle with in terms of seeing Trump's facial expressions. Rodney, how is it to hear this? It's kind of an intense expression.
Well, I appreciate that. I think you've given us a good bridge from that. I think you've filled in that gap. Appreciate that.
Yeah, very good. Rodney, tell me, would you like me to keep going? Would you like people to break into groups? What would you like right now?
How about, I don't know where it's a convenient place for you to stop, but I think that we need to break by, let's say, 8:15.
Okay,
so that we can break into
I'll
groups.
go for another 6 minutes.
Thank you.
We'll get to the second group of things. Okay, so allowing ourselves to perceive and understand impact. The next group of white fragility patterns is seeing ourselves as individuals exempt from the forces of racial socialization. I'm not racist. Me? We have a failure to understand that we bring our group's history with us and that history matters. We claim exemption from the forces of racism as an ally. I want you to know that I'm an ally. I don't have anything to do with white supremacy and the wanting to get over the hard personal work and jump to solutions. This takes us into an understanding of left and right hemispheres in the human brain. The right hemisphere looks at the big picture, and the left works on the details. Ian McGilchrist, my favorite writer about the left and right hemisphere, says, we prize the details but scorn the big picture. So when we say, I'm not racist, we don't want to know about the systemic, and we're just focused on the detail of self. Here's a picture of Ian McGilchrist on the left and Alan Shore on the right, two of the writers that I lean into most heavily when I'm talking about left and right hemispheres. Our right hemispheres are structured by relationships, and they are the place where brain change happens. The left and right hemisphere even have different cortical structures, and throughout the animal kingdom, the right hemisphere weighs more than the left hemisphere throughout all vertebrates. And there are two ways that we can be in the world. We can be in the world looking at the details and staying focused on the details. We can be in the world looking at the big picture and understanding the systemic and seeing the impact of the systemic. We can look at other people and we can see them as functions or we can look at other people and we can see them as souls. So this takes us back to our exploration of in-group, out-group. In order to be able to see another person as soul, we really have to see them. And if we see the other person as part of an out-group that we do not belong to, then we won't be able to look at them closely enough to see them as soul. The left hemisphere is the easier hemisphere to be in, because the right hemisphere carries the impact of trauma throughout our lives. And whenever we move into the right hemisphere, we're also moving into an area that can carry a lot of unprocessed trauma. The left hemisphere is easier. It's where the dopamine flows. It's where we can do routine. It's where we can make people of other races not human so that we don't have to deal with any of this stuff. And it views groups as hierarchical. The right hemisphere sees us as a joined circle, but there's complexity in moving into the right hemisphere if we're too mired in our in-group, out-group thinking. So an ongoing remedy for this tendency that we have not to see others as human is to acknowledge personal and collective responsibility and to acknowledge impact. And I wanted to give you a definition of collective responsibility that I really appreciate. Also known as collective guilt, this is a concept in which individuals are responsible for other people's actions by tolerating, ignoring, or harboring them without actively collaborating in these actions. And this is where the responsibility lies for so many of us, for all of us who are white-bodied in this world. We have the responsibility for all white-bodied persons' actions, and we tolerate, ignore, or harbor them, even without actively collaborating in these actions. And this gives us collective responsibility that needs to be acknowledged. Look at my watch.
I have a question, Sarah.
Sure.
Can you go back?
Yeah.
Are you saying, or would you say, could you go back to that slide about collective responsibility?
Sure.
That I would say I grew up and I'm often around white-bodied people who say, you know, I'm not responsible. You know, we didn't grow up this way. I didn't do that. That's certainly how I was brought up,
right,
as, you know, from immigrant, second and third generation immigrants. Are you saying that, or it seems to me that is really a hallmark of white fragility?
Yes,
like,
it is.
Yeah, that it's an excuse, it's a protection from going to uncomfortable systemic truths.
Yes, exactly.
And it seems really important for those of us, there are many of us on this call who are activists, you know, who are really committed to being accomplices and allies and activists, and that this is something for us to really take up. Yeah. Thank you. This is really important.
It's so important. And then we'll just take a moment to name guilt, that because this is a huge thing that we see with white fragility all the time, is that if people start to let this in, then it's coming into the right hemisphere and it's flooding them, and they can't bear it. They cannot bear the idea that they've been doing harm and that they have collective responsibility. And so white-bodied people so often sidestep this whole issue in order not to step into this paralyzing guilt and this confusion that's carried between personal responsibility and collective responsibility. Because if we carry that confusion within us and we don't understand the difference, then we make ourselves too responsible, and then we stop being responsive at all. People really don't know, people want to know that they're doing harm. And since collective responsibility requires us to grow up into a certain kind of maturity, where we're able to say, by my very skin, I am part of the harm that's been done on this continent to, in specific, the group that we enslaved more than any other, the African Americans. The group that we redlined more than any other, the African Americans. If we do not step into, yes, there is a part of this responsibility that is mine, and yet it is not personal. It requires action. It doesn't require paralyzing guilt. This is such an important remedy. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to make the slides available. I can have my assistant make them into a PDF, and you'll be able to look at them if you would like. Yeah, very glad, very grateful to have been here with you. Rodney, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate what you've talked to us about tonight, and the way that you've helped us to think more deeply about some of these issues. I have lots of questions, to be sure, and I'm sure that a lot of other folks probably have tons of questions again. So if I'm going to turn it over to Roberta to talk about what we're going to do. I'm going to reclaim host, and then we'll be able to divide us into groups. So I've got that now. But
Okay.
But just one question I want to think about before we go: how do we move from? How do we move people from? I think there's almost a moment where guilt is necessary in order to say, there's something I've done that needs to be atoned for.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's guilt or at least some sense of acknowledgement, but how do we move from that sense of acknowledgement to action that might help to, and I don't want to just remove to random action, but to sort of help people find a mode of action that might actually help shift systems that are problematic.
If we want to shift people out of paralyzing guilt into action, the best way that I've found is to allow them to name their mourning, to even ask them, do you need acknowledgement that you are so sad that this is true? And this creates connection and the possibility for movement. We live in a world where our culture tells us we're not supposed to ever express sadness. And so having it named allows bodies to be freed from patterns of immobilization and paralysis.
Thank you so much. Roberta?
Yeah. So Rodney's going to put us into small groups, total random. And I just want to offer two prompts. One is we've been working in these conversations on what we've been calling the chain of connection. So after the first person speaks and you want to speak, see if you could just begin your words with something that connects to what the person before you said. Preferably something new that you actually learned from them, so that and just, learning from a neuroscience point of view, this is creating the kinds of relationships that I think Sarah's talking about, that take us to a deeper place of healing and connecting and knowing each other. So, and it's just a request, it's very free form, and there's no tone policing. I would just say to try it out though. So often when we are in what we call, political discussions, it just becomes, I give my information, you give your information. It's like we're just throwing data at each other and we're not creating relationships. So let's really use these small groups to give our brains the opportunity to become more relational in this sphere. And then the second prompt I want to give is, if you are someone who generally has a lot to say and jumps in quickly, I'm one of those people, think about holding back. And if you are someone who generally holds back, think about jumping in. So all of these little prompts are ways that we create a relational safety together.
And
I love that. Do you want to give us also a prompt question just to get us started?
How about, do you have one, Sarah?
Well, Stephen put, where does agency for change in this journey through privilege and fragility? Where does agency for change come from? It's quite a beautiful question. Mm-hmm. And also, I'll leave you now, and I'll say good night and thank you, and so grateful to have been with you all.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't think I understand the question.
Where
Steve,
does our,
you want to explain it?
Let Stephen say it.
You have to unmute yourself, Stephen. Stephen Stern. Still muted. Stephen Stern is still muted. Can people unmute themselves?
They can. And I just asked him to unmute himself.
Oh, okay. Stephen, can you just explain your question in a couple of sentences?
I was preparing to hold back and listen.
Good call.
But I won't. Look, in terms of a lifetime journey through what is privilege and what is fragility, and I think the fact for me and others in my position that I'm journeying is important. What is it as we come against the hard rock of racism ruins lives? What is it that helps us find the agency for change? I think continuing and progressive listening and proximity to the extent that it's meaningful for people of color to their lives is a great resource. But there is that question of, I'm a little stuck on that, on the earlier, the more power we have, the more inspiring we find ourselves in these brain rewards. I understand that as a deflection point of power that takes you away from finding any kind of agency for change. But there's a level in which both the inspiration I find in myself and the inspiration I find in others is crucial. And mobilizing that while dealing with, once again in this country, with a special toxicity, you know, we are finding ourselves facing another reckoning with the fact that racism ruins lives. I don't know if that clarified.
Rodney just sent a beautiful recap of this question. Let me just put it in the chat for everyone that I think opens it for everyone. Is that okay, Rodney?
Yeah, I was trying to do that for everyone, and yeah. I kept sending it to you, so please forgive me.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Did I get it in? Did we get it into the thing?
Yeah.
So this is the question that I mean, this might be a prompt for us to ask. After having learned a bit about the brain science behind white fragility, how might we use this knowledge to begin to act towards change? How might we use our power in new ways that can achieve, be active for change? I don't know if that makes sense as a question, but hopefully that'll just at least start the conversations.
All right, and so what I suggest is that everyone copy the question, and then when you get into your small group, paste it in the chat, so that way you have it on hand.
You can open the chat and see what's been written in there. You just have to push the chat button again once you get into small groups.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So I'm going to divide people into groups of groups of 4 people, 4 or 5 people, and I will bounce around in there. I think we lost Sarah, but hopefully everybody will be able to have conversations. And what I'd love to do is to talk from now until about 8:45, and then come back together into a plenary just to begin to talk about what we heard in the small groups, and just sort of have some dialogue about that collectively in the larger plenary. Sound good?
Yeah, and Catherine Betts, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wasn't quite clear on the invitation you had extended earlier, Roberta, on how to respond to the people who spoke before us, but maybe somebody in my small group can help me understand. So I'm okay going into.
So, yeah. So, and literally what Roberta was saying, and I'll let her tell because she said it. So. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just maybe begin what you're going to say with a few words that connect to what you heard from the other person, something you appreciate that they say, or how you're building on what they say, or what you learned from what they say, so that we're creating a relational chain of conversation. Is that helpful, Catherine? Yeah, okay, thank you.
So do you want to model that for just a second? So let me just say, as I listened to this conversation, Roberta, I was really struck by the fact that oftentimes we're unaware of what keeps us from seeing each other across the racial divide by these patterns that have been established within our brain and the way that we work. And often when we think about notions of defensiveness and things of this nature, things that keep us separated from each other, we often don't know that there's a larger issue that's going on in the brain behind our resistance to hearing about the way that others feel, the way that others appreciate this, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so I just got 2 powerful ideas from Rodney, and I'll just say that the second one, how often we're in a conversation, we're having a reaction, and we're just not aware that the reaction has to do with the whole systemic situation, you know, the bigger groups, the culture that we live in, everything that's going on. Is that kind of the second part?
I love that. Yeah, I think that you picked up on exactly what I was saying.
Yeah, yeah. And now I'll go on and say what I wanted to say. So this is like a trick way to train yourself that when someone else is speaking, you're really listening to what they're saying instead of what we usually do. Oh, what am I going to say? And you don't even hear what the other person said. So I mean, Sarah was said so many times, it's creating a relational connection that actually changes the shape of our brain, the chemistry of our brain. So we have to do more than just sit in a room with someone, right? We have to like become active listeners and connect with what they're saying. All right, and you know, there's no right or wrong. It's just learning, and I'm convinced that just the effort is going to do something different in our brains. Just the effort toward being relational.
All right, I'm going to put you into groups right now.
Thanks,
you can join in the group. Yeah, very good.
Just curious, Wave, if you would have wanted a little more time in the small groups.
Yeah.
Okay.
I recognize that that there was a great conversation going on in each of them, and I was really sorry to pull everybody back. I said I'd pull you back at 8:45, and then I said, let me give you a few more minutes, but it's still probably not nearly enough time. But I did want us to have a chance to begin to just sort of share in the larger group some of the things that came out in your small group discussions. So I'm going to just do this as I do it in class. How about we start off with group 1?
Oh, well, you have to remember what group you were in.
Exactly. Okay, we'll start off with the group. Let's see. Hey, Roberto, I'll pick on you. We'll start off with your group first. You'd be the group that goes first. How's that?
All right. I believe we are group 3. Well, I think that we really witnessed each other struggling very deeply to understand how do we be more relational given our history, whether we're, yeah, and I'm really struck also by how what we're talking about are things that have lived with us since we were children, that we all have been aware and on some level struggling, and that as we are maybe learning more about privilege and how it shows up in us and between us, we're kind of in a state of maybe confusion, and you know that it just, Stephen was in our group, so we were really with his question, and just really grateful. I'm so grateful for this group. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's try the group that Greg was in. I think that was group 4. I'm not sure, but if you all want to share a little bit about how your conversation went. And I'm not picking on you, Greg. You don't have to report for everybody, but just let's hear from your larger group.
I'll share a minute. This was a great experience. I got from our group that I heard from a woman speak that she lived in a place where there was a lot of racism, and she would go out the door every day and feel racism from people all around her, and that was affecting her health, which touched my heart deeply. And she also spoke about her grandchild wanting an education and how deeply the mourning is of people of color who cannot afford to give their children and grandchildren the kind of, you know, easy access to education that people of privilege have. So these are just 2 things that came up that touched me.
Can I also say that add that Greg talked about what do we do about the people who hate people of color? Mm. You know, there are some organizations that hate people who hate people of color, and they wouldn't mind seeing us dead. He's right about that. And then one of the other things that I asked, what about fear? Because people who have privilege, in most cases, I would venture to say, they don't easily give up that privilege, and they don't want to give up that privilege. And so acknowledging white privilege and racism and lack of opportunity for those who do not have white privilege means, not only might mean to them, but actually will mean that they'll have to share some of that privilege, which will mean less for them. You know, so that's something that we didn't talk about. But finally, I don't want to dominate, but finally, one of the things that I learned that will be very helpful, because I do live around a bunch of people who are Trump supporters, and you know, we have these discussions and they are dismissive, or they don't want to acknowledge racism or lack of opportunities for minorities. And I think that by approaching them with something that was told to us might help. How do you think I feel, you know, when minorities are treated this way, or when I'm afraid when my son goes out of the house each time that something might happen to him because of the color of his skin? How do you think I feel? Mm-hmm. You know?
Amen. Thank you for that. Thank you for not just the recitation of what went on in the group, but that question there about fear. And I wonder if a fear is evident not just on behalf of those who experience issues of racism, but as you were talking earlier about, what does it mean to lose privilege? Is there a fear associated with losing privilege that forces something else up, that tries to mask that fear? Thank you. for that. The group that Jennifer was in, I don't think that group has spoken yet.
I nominate Daniel to speak for our group. He had some great ideas.
Amen.
Yeah, I could say something. I think we had a really good conversation with our group, and something that stood out early on was the way that disgust had impacted the group, like the thought of disgust and how it and like how it affects the brain and like how it affects the way that people connect with others.
Mm-hmm.
The way that disgust helps to solidify out groups and in people's minds and stuff like that, and how important it is to pay attention to that, to when disgust is being used against someone, paying attention when someone's being othered, and also something else that stemmed from our conversation is like how when people are I guess emotional, when people are emotional, that things can happen really fast, and that people can get really caught up in their feelings and their ideas. As a matter of fact, they kind of become their feelings and ideas, and they become so identified, so connected with their feelings and ideas that if somebody disagrees with those feelings and ideas, or someone, if that person feels like someone's attacking their feelings and ideas, they will feel like that they themselves are being attacked. That if they identify as someone that is of the right or the left, that they begin to identify completely with that. They think that they are that thing, right? So somebody, they can take things really, really personal, like, oh, you're attacking me, not just the idea, right? And very importantly, like the action that we thought about for taking against this, or to address this, is really like questions, or like finding ways to slow things down, because when things are going too fast, it's easy to miss empathy. It's easy to miss humanity. So what can slow people down? Sometimes just like to think, and how can we get people to think? Really, it's by a question. When we ask someone a question, even if they don't answer it, they thought about it. And with the right question, you never know, you can really open someone up. So that's just kind of where our conversation was heading while we had the conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Appreciate your report. Anybody else from that group want to jump in quickly?
The only thing that I would add, when Daniel talks about separating into the right and the left, and that is that in an election year, people purposely try to get us to do that. They purposely play up negative things and try to get that whole cultural identity that Daniel was referring to get that to be part of our, not just our belief or our stance on one issue, but who we define ourselves to be as a person, which is what makes it so much more combative. And that we need to get past that and have the humility to actively listen and ask those questions to slow things down.
Good. Thank you for that. And I love that that you came back to this notion of active listening as we move forward. I really appreciate that. The last group, who wants to represent the last group? Please, Kathy.
Okay. Well, I think what stood out the most for me, and I know Rob Thomas had to jump off the call, I think on account of children or no, an early morning. But what stood out the most for me was, he said, well, he was telling about his experience of proximity as a truck driver, needing to share, driving with this man who had a Confederate flag tattoo. And he said, proximity is not enough, because a lot of damage can happen. And, the kinds of comments that this man made against Africans and against Puerto Ricans or Latinos was so damaging that at a certain point, he just did not really even want to engage any further with this man. And that, you know, he says it's really up to, and I think, you know, for me, the big takeaway is that it's really up to white people to deal with with other white people who are actively harming through their racism. Would anyone else like to chime in?
I just wanted to give Annalisa a chance to speak because you got just cut off at the end of the group and you were just speaking. So just unmute yourself.
What I was saying is that my father's family is from Puerto Rico. My mother's family is African American. She passed away, and I grew up necessarily in this very diverse setting. And so, to be honest with you, it's very hard for me to understand how people can be closed-minded. It's very hard for me, and I haven't had the experience of being next to any people who support Trump. It's just not part of my. I live in Harlem, you know, so you know, I think folks are very brave, you know, to take folks, you know, that are Trumpers on and to do it in a way that is not confrontational, but, you know, to really keep listening and trying to persuade rather than confront.
Thank you for that. And thank you. I mean, it's wonderful to see that we've got people from so many different places. This has been a really rich geographical conversation tonight with people from New York and a couple people from New York area, a few people from the DC area, a lot of people from North Carolina. We have at least one or two people from California as well. So this has been a rich conversation with people from different perspectives as well. So I really appreciate different locations, I should say. Really appreciate what was said tonight, and thank you all for just joining us. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for being open and willing to try something new in terms of active listening, in terms of building that chain of communication, hearing what was said before, reflecting a bit on it as you moved on. I saw there a great intentionality in the small groups to people trying to do that. Let Roberta say final greetings, and then I'll give you one more thing before I say goodbye.
2 points for my final greeting. One is that we're going to do a training in hopefully a one-day training in nonviolent communication that I think will really build on what we heard from Sarah and different things that have come up, including my number 2 point. The idea of guilt is very complex, and there's a real way of working with it in the context of nonviolent communication. And also what came up when Rodney was popping in, what you were bringing up, Rodney, about, you know, how does switching to I statements really foster that relational possibility. And there's a lot to switching to I statements beyond saying I feel. Mm-hmm. So that's just some of the topics that I would really look forward to exploring. And send us, whoever you got the invite for this, send us your requests for the next conversations. We've been having them. This is at least our 5th one. And they're all just so nourishing. It's just so nourishing to be together like this. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much for that. Joyce, I just want to say thank you for giving us that I comment statement and for triggering that larger aspect of the discourse. And I look forward to exploring that much deeper as we go on. Anything that you wanted to suggest to that we attend with the Nonviolent Communications Group?
Well, actually, there is this coming weekend. There's a 3-day or 2.5-day festival with 38 different trainers. I'm giving a workshop on NVC, integrating NVC and Buddhism, which is one of my passions, about making specific doable requests. So if you go to the NVC Academy, oh wait, best thing is to email me actually, because I have a discount coupon for that I can share with people. So that's one possibility. Yeah.
Thank you. I like discount coupons. I don't know why. I just want to say that those of you who would like to join us tomorrow night, the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation is having a conversation on, in essence, how people of God are working to foster change in the larger world. We're going to hear from Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, who is I don't know what the official term is, the PCUSA, but the director of the Office for Public Witness with the Presbyterian Church. He works with in a group with an ecumenical organization with the Presbyterians, the Methodists, UUs, a group of other folks in a building across from the Supreme Court and the Capitol building, working on how do we get our legislators to know about issues that we need to work on, helping to mobilize people that come to DC to work for social change. And that'll be tomorrow. And if you're interested in doing that, you can, I don't know how to best find it, you can look at the Facebook page for the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and find the way to join that link there. Is that right, Erin? Is it the best way?
I just posted it in the chat, Rodney, where it says join meeting. So that's not a individual passcode, just everybody uses that same.
Just use the same thing, and then it will give you, I think it'll give you an individual passcode, won't it?
I don't know, but what time is that tomorrow?
Way to get in. That's at 7 tomorrow evening, so the same time as tonight, 7 tomorrow evening. Well, thank you all for joining us. I look forward to having you again for a subsequent conversation as we do the work of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, as we offer forums on Just Talk, Talk Just, dealing with issues of race, and as we start to move towards a one-day nonviolent communications training. We've got a lot that we've got going on, and we really want you all to participate fully in the work of the center. Thank you so much. Thank you, Roberta, always for everything that you've given us. Thank you, Sarah, who's not with us anymore, for just a rich basis of conversation tonight. She planted great seeds in that seed bed. And look forward to seeing you again. God bless.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good talking with you.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rodney. Thanks, Roberta.
Thanks, Roberta. Thanks, Rodney.